Hi, I'm Steve Tierney. Welcome to the Madhouse podcast. Okay, so today we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of talking about set pieces about the game and news of what's going on, a lot of the gameplay in DungeonWorld, or the role play certainly between players, takes place on a Yahoo group, the DungeonWorld Yahoo group, obviously. Now I have tried to encourage people to move to other mediums, most notably Facebook and Twitter, but my players do tend to stick in the place that they like and are familiar with, which is cool. So a lot of the discussion does go on the Yahoo group, and that's where people kind of ask questions and do some role play, and it's both in and out of character. Anyway, the players obviously who are listening to the podcast and looking at what's going on, and one player, Scott, asked some interesting questions on the Yahoo group today, which I thought would be useful for people who didn't know how the game worked, for new players, or for anyone that was uncertain or unsure quite how a game like DungeonWorld can also have role playing in it. Because in the game of DungeonWorld you control characters, and it's Diablo-esque, I suppose, although it does actually predate Diablo. But you control adventurers mostly, and the adventurers go out and explore the world, bash things up, beat up monsters, take their stuff, the usual thing. And so how does role-playing happen in that, given it is a turn-based game? Well, it happens between the turns, and the game is big enough and has enough complexity built up over the years that it enables players to, I suppose, take ownership of parts of it and role-play around the structure of actual gameplay. And we watch that, the GMs, or myself mostly these days, watch that and listen to it and attempt to guide the main plot, if you like, following some of what the players actually do in the game and some of what they role-play out of the game. Anyway, so let's go into the questions Scott asked and try my best to answer them. So, as has been noted, we have a new ruler of Bernie, Prince Dickon. No doubt will become King Dickon in due course. And that character is controlled by a player. Now, there are lots of named positions and characters in the game of DungeonWorld and the Kingdom of Bernie and the other lands. They aren't all controlled by players. Some of them are NPCs that run in the background and are named, but a player doesn't actually control their actions. The GMs do. But quite a lot of the positions are also controlled by players, and the new ruler is controlled by a player, Bill. So, looking at the questions, and the questions go as follows. They've noted that the new ruler now has to appoint state advisors, clarify the dukes and duchesses, appoint a high priest, appoint a high mage, and set up plans to fight the insurrection that's ongoing in the game. And the question is, so before we all start lobbying for positions, says Scott, how exactly does the kingdom work? Well, the gist of it is this. The kingdom is I've described how it works over many years, and the players are familiar with the fact that there's a ruler, there's a high mage, and there's a high priest, and they are essentially, the high priest's job is to oversee the religion of the land, which is the 6 gods of light, and the high mage's job is to oversee what management there is of the magicians and other types of mage in the land. And they're notable positions, but they don't actually have a lot to do in the game. They're there for a role-playing aspect, and they have most often been NPCs, but players have controlled them in the past. So as the new rule of the game, a real player now gets to say who is the high priest and who is the high mage, and they may choose to name a high priest or high mage who is an NPC. They might even invent one, and then I'll run with that. Or they may choose to name a high priest or a high mage who is a player character. That will be fine too, whatever they really choose to do. But you can be sure that whatever they choose to do will have consequences, because you don't know what those players will then do and how they will roleplay, and it can all get quite interesting and fun. So they've got to appoint state advisors. Well, they can be anything you like, really. There are a number of them that have built up over the years that have been named in the past, but a new king can appoint anything they want. So if they decided they wanted an advisor on farming or an advisor on estates, which is, there's a special position type called an estate where players can control their lord and they control a state. It's more of a management position than an adventuring position, and there aren't as many of them, but they are quite popular and interesting. So if the king or the ruler wanted to appoint a state advisor on estates, they could do that. And what powers that would have? Well, that would depend. Again, it would normally be a role-playing position, which can be more effective than you think, but we could build stuff into the game and adjust stuff in the game to reflect things that happened. And it's always a balance. If you're a GM, you've got to make it possible to play this kind of macro grand game and the role-playing aspects of it, but it mustn't be that stuff happens to players who've got characters who they're paying to play. You don't want to be just doing your own thing, adventuring in one of the dungeons, say the Dungeons of Drax, and your characters are wandering through there beating up monsters, and then suddenly the king makes a law and 3 of your characters are locked up in prison because he's made necromancers outlawed, for instance, or something like that. So I try to avoid doing things that will damage the general fun gameplay of people who are paying to play, and free players. But there has to be enough reflection of what the ruler is doing and what is going on in the game that people notice it and they're aware that the game is bigger than just the simplistic, perhaps, gameplay that they're taking part in. So how does it work? Well, it works as a cooperation between the players who are interested in getting into the macro side of it and myself as the GM. And it's kind of a dialogue, I suppose, the best way to describe it. In the end, I get the final decision because I'm the GM and it's my business. I've got to make sure it makes money and doesn't go bust. But it's done all right over the years, and I think the secret is in getting the balance right. The secret is in making sure that people have fun but don't feel like the game is playing them. And I think we mostly get it right, and where we don't, we make adjustments. So what else does Scott ask? Well, let's have a quick look. He says, who are the state advisors? A council of generic advisors or specific roles: Minister of War, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Groom of the Stall, etc. Groom of the Stall. Anyway, whatever. And again, the ruler can appoint whatever he wants. I mean, he can make it as complex or as simple as he chooses, and the player controlling that can really have a lot of fun with this, or can be a bit more hands-off. And if the player would prefer that we continue to do the work from the GM side, then that will be fine too. That's as I say, it's a dialogue, but it's going to be interesting to see how it pans out. So then Scott asks, does every city have a duke or duchess? Well, yes. Every city in the game should have a duke or duchess. That's part of the makeup of the game. So the gist is, dukes and duchesses are people who rule a city on behalf of the ruler. So they're the second tier, if you like, of management in the kingdom. And every city should have one. And back when the game started, they did all have a named one, and they were all NPCs, and some players have controlled cities since then, but broadly that's kind of drifted away. There's not so much of that now. The players, because it's really only a roleplay position, you don't actually run the duke or duchess with the management of the city. That position type has never been developed, but you could have a character who was a big adventurer who went around bashing up dungeons but was the duke of, say, Poldoon, a big city, and then you could roleplay that within the game, and other players will respond to that and respect the fact that you are a duke or duchess or whatever. So I would like to think that lots more of those will now be player controlled, but again, that's a decision for the new ruler to make. He can check out the ones that exist. There aren't too many of them that are named now. Some of them have passed away, some of them have been forgotten, but we've got the opportunity now to refresh them all. So every city should end up with a duke or a duchess, with the exception of the ones that have been taken over by the invaders, which that will be up to the king whether he appoints a duke or a duchess in absence or not. That'll be interesting. Okay, so then Scott asks, what does he ask next? Apart from a title, what is the role of a duke? Well, again, it's a role-playing thing primarily. We can do some stuff behind the scenes, and we will, but again, it's back to that balance between gameplay and the role-playing feel of the game, and actually interfering too much in the gameplay and making people think, well, you know, this game is playing me. That's not a situation I ever want to get into. So Scott asks, do we currently have a high priest? Well, yes, there is nominally a high priest always in the kingdom. I don't think we've got a named one at the moment. If my memory is correct, I have to check that, but I don't think so, so it's probably time to do that. Is the position just ceremonial, or does it carry some weight? Well, it does carry some weight in a role-play perspective. Again, it's like the dukes and the duchesses. It doesn't have an in-game thing it can do at the moment, but it would be notable from a role-play point of view wherever players were interacting with one another. And it says, and hypothetically, what if the prince removed the duke and the duke didn't want to leave? Well, in the game, the ruler has absolute control over the kingdom. That's the kind of setting that it is. That in the end, the ruler can do pretty much anything they want in theory, but there are political realities to that. So certainly, the king has a right to remove a duke or a duchess and appoint a different one if they want to. There would be in-game role-playing consequences to that, which, again, we'll have to see how they panned out, but anybody who started doing too much would potentially find themselves in a difficult situation if they needed allies, and particularly now the kingdom's under threat and there's attacks from all sides. It would be a dangerous gambit but it might be something that the new ruler decides they want to try. So what else is asked here? Does a character need to be a priest, or is a crusader acceptable? For those of you who don't play the game, priests are the traditional kind of servant of the gods in the game. They have the ability to heal, they have the ability to create mana bread, which you eat to get healed. They are the ones who carry the word of the 6 gods of light to the people, if you like. Crusaders are more like what I think in Dungeons and Dragons would be called a paladin. Crusaders, although the priests worship all 6 of the gods supposedly equally, they may have favourites, but they're supposed to worship all 6 of the gods of light equally. The Crusaders each follow a different one of the 3 male and 3 female gods of light. They, just like the priests, they also are supposed to worship all 6, but they specialise in the word, if you like, the writ, the holy words of one particular one of the gods. And in the game, they're really kind of a tough fighter with a penchant for one of the gods or goddesses. Either one of those would be okay, but usually the high priest is a priest and not a crusader. So because there's also a position called Lord Crusader, which is the head of all the crusaders. But you could, I mean, in the end, the king can appoint whoever they like, but there are consequences to it. Then he says, what about a very, very pious necromancer? Again, as I said, the ruler can do whatever they want to do. They make the laws, they can instruct a change in the laws. They almost everything the ruler can overrule the courts about. It is the court's job to look at precedent of what the previous rulers have done and to try and give good guidance and to step in if there is no ruler, as happened recently. But broadly, when there's a ruler in place, they can do whatever they want. That's the situation, the political situation. The realities of it are just as I described earlier. It's a dangerous gambit. If you put a very pious necromancer as the high priest, I think you would face such a backlash from role-playing players and characters in the game. It would create an incredibly difficult situation, which I think, well, it'd be interesting, but I don't think many people would be foolish enough to do it, but you just never know, do you? So that's all the questions that Scott asked me, and I hope by answering them I've managed to kind of fill in some of how the game works a little bit and give you an idea. For the next podcast, what I'd really like to do is answer some questions from other players. So if you've listened to this podcast and any questions have come up, they could be about the current situation and the new ruler, or they could be anything else you like, really. Why don't you either send them to me on the Yahoo group or email them to me, and you can email them to me on the usual address, contact@madcentral.com, and I'll be happy to try and answer them on the next podcast. Until then, see ya!